Welcome to the Lover's Hole, where we're reading the Aubrey Maturin books of Patrick O'Brian. Many of you rereading, some of you, we hope, reading perhaps for the first time. And with that in mind, you're with Mike.
And you're with Ian.
And we are starting up Chapter 5 in our slowed down read through of Master and Commander. Ian, catch us up on Chapter 4 and what we're looking forward to this time.
My pleasure, Mike. Last time, Jack, who's shaking down the crew of his new vessel, the Sophie, he had his gunnery practice interrupted when part of the convoy, this Norwegian cat that they were escorting, was taken by a galley. And Jack and Lieutenant Dillon and the brig Sophie and her crew all kind of grew and developed together as a crew as they went into action. They had stopped chasing the galley to go back and attend to the rest of the convoy, not entirely to everyone's satisfaction, as we're going to hear shortly. Jack realized that he had his old childhood friend, Queenie, to thank for his promotion and for this cruise that he's been given by his commander-in-chief, the still virile Admiral Keith. The members of the gun room had celebrated the beginning of the cruise, and they'd celebrated Stephen Maturin's appointment as surgeon. That was last time. This time, we're going to get into the log of Sophie, and that log is going to promise us already the first prize and maybe more. There's going to be an apocalyptic blow. There's going to be a brush with the plague. Jack's going to get a chance to prove himself once more. We're going to get some scatological humor. And Mike, who's going to be the butt of all these jokes, I wonder? We're going to have labor and delivery amongst the gunpowder. We're going to have a look back at a famous uprising and a chance for Stephen Maturin and James Dillon to get to know one another better. Maybe. So, Mike, we know that this chapter is going to take a lot of interest in logs and documents and documentation. We start out already in the log of the Sophie, right?
We do. You know, and it's one of those great O'Brian techniques. He's going to lift words right from, I'm sure, actual logs from actual ships and put them right into our story. So he starts Chapter 5 by saying, the fair copy of the Sophie's log was written out in David Richards' unusually beautiful copperplate. But in all other respects, it was just like every other logbook in the service. Its tone of semi-literate, official, righteous dullness never varied. It spoke of the opening of beef cask number 271 and the death of the loblolly boy in exactly the same voice. And it never deviated into human prose, even for the taking of the sloop's first prize. So we have in a couple of things here. One, you know, for it's a pretty, not just foreshadowing, but hey, there's going to be a prize. Oh my gosh. And O'Brian's got us right there, not only with, I'm sure, what he read, as we said, in a log, but Copperplate. Probably familiar to you, but a new one for me.
Well, I don't know about familiar, but it's certainly a name that took me back to what was going on in my education. So I belong to a generation that was being taught to write back in the very early 70s. And Copperplate was kind of my parents' generation, kind of the fancy way of writing, this very sloped, looped, italic, cursive script where I think it descends from the days when you would always write with a fountain pen or a pen dipped in liquid ink. And to get smooth script, you had to keep your pen gliding along the page. So Copperplate is this very beautiful italicized script. By the time the 70s came along and experiment in education was rife, including with writing and reading, we were all taught to write in a more upright, more kind of plain italic way. And it was okay to lift the pen off the page. And we were probably therefore writing with ballpoint pens rather than with fountain pens. But this Copperplate is still, if you go back and read old documents, read, registers of birth, marriages, and deaths dating back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you would still see people writing officially in this beautiful kind of looped style of writing here. I love the fact, as you say, Mike, that we've got this spoiler already in this log saying we're going to have this first prize. So in true O'Brian style, though, we're going to have to wait. And instead of getting straight on and telling us about this blooming prize, we pick up on this remark of ditto weather that is mentioned in the log entry. And that brings us back to the fact that it's Sunday. And we've got this picture that O'Brien paints for us of the veteran seamen taking care of themselves and each other. They're combing out and plaiting up their long hair. He talks about them looking like ancient oracles. And they're practicing a little bit, as sailors like to do, on the landsmen. They're pointing out to the landsmen what he calls the livid, purple, tumescent, deeply cloud-banked western sky where the sun is sinking, and talking about what it portends. Tumescent is a good signature word for O'Brien. It's a sexually provocative way of talking about the swollen and engorged, and you might say sexually aroused-looking skyline. Okay. The strange sticky heat that comes from the sky and from the glassy sea, he says, the swell that comes from the south and the east mean, in the words of the text, a coming dissolution of all natural bonds, an apocalyptic upheaval, a right dirty night ahead. And as well as winding up the landsmen who've never been through a storm, I think he's also winding us up to expect a bit more of this kind of salacious, saucy imagery as we get on through the chapter here.
Yeah, and I can see these landsmen, listening to all these sailors here, and they're already a little bit low, a bit on edge because of this unnatural death of the loblolly boy. The log was very succinct in mentioning it, but Henry Gouges, we're told, had announced his 50th birthday to his mates, and sitting there at the table, holding his grog, immediately died as soon as he said it, as O'Brien tells us, with his untasted grog in his hand. And it was just that morning, that Sunday morning, that he'd been buried at sea. Just as the sailors had predicted, the storm starts at the end of the last dog watch. So we're about 8 in the evening now. But by 4 in the morning, it's exceeding all the sailors' exaggerations. O'Brien writes, the men at the wheel had to hold their heads down and cup their mouths sideways to breathe. But the Sophie handles it really well. And in the midst of these steep, tall rollers, O'Brien writes that the Sophie, with her top gallant mast struck down on deck, her guns double breached, and her hatches battened down, leaving only a little screened way to the after ladder. And with 100 miles of sea room under her lee, she lay as snug and unconcerned as an eider duck.
It's a lovely image, isn't it? First of all, of the Sophie kind of bobbing up and down on the waves like a duck just kind of taking it all in its stride. The eider duck, a very common species of duck in Europe, famous for most of us who can remember when quilts were called eider downs, famous for having its feathers, its breast feathers, used as a stuffing for pillows and quilts, and probably not an accidental reference for O'Brien, the first ever species of bird to be protected by law. A law written by that famous Northumbrian saint, Saint Cuthbert, back in the year 676. Hey, Mike, those were the days, eh?
Yeah, for sure.
So as the Sophie's riding the waves, Jack is watching her, his arm around a backstay. By the way, this image of Jack with his arm hooked around a stay enjoying the weather, we get that quite a few times in the Peter Weir movie as well. The text says his streaming yellow hair, which he wore loose and long as a tribute to Lord Nelson, stood straight out behind him at the top of each wave and sank in the troughs in between. Great image of Jack really, really enjoying this weather. He's really pleased with the way the ship is handling herself in the storm. And he turns and tells Stephen in this very offhand, kind of sailorish way, the ship is remarkably dry. And this is a complete non sequitur for Stephen. How can you describe anything in the world as dry, given the storm that we've just sailed through? Unlike the Sophie, unlike her captain, unlike her crew, the surgeon is not handling this weather very well. But Stephen, he says, Stephen, who preferring to die in the open had crept up on deck, had been made fast to a stanchion, and now stood mute, sodden, and appalled. Oh, my poor Stephen.
Yeah, lashed to this stanchion in the midst of this incredible rain, and Jack is hollering, "It's remarkably dry." Stephen is sure he's making fun of him. I have to think.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen's much happier in the morning when the storm is over and the sky is washed so clean that he can see the color of the petrel's feet following the ship. So birds, I can see them in detail. Stephen's a happy lad. And speaking out loud, Stephen says, I remember the fact of extreme prostrating terror. And he's kind of keeping his eye on the bird. He says, but the inward nature of the emotion now escapes me. Now, he's standing there on deck. There are two men by the wheel, and they're kind of disturbed hearing Stephen talk about this. This is probably a very unlucky thing to be bringing this back up. And then, oh my gosh, heaven forbid, Stephen starts to compare this experience to a woman's experience in childbirth. And O'Brien writes, the man at the wheel and the quartermaster looked hastily away from one another. This was terrible. Anybody might hear. The Sophie surgeon, the opener in broad daylight, and upon the entrance main deck of the gunner's brain pan, Lazarus Day, as he was now called, was much prized. That is, Stephen, much prized, but there was no telling how far he might go in impropriety. And luckily, a serendipitous sighted sail stopped Stephen's soliloquy suddenly.
Oh, bravo. Good work.
Let's try that 7 times fast. I'm sure we'll get an outtake there. Sorry, I got carried away with my alliteration.
No, I love it. Absolutely love it. Great bit of humor of the perplexed view that the sailors have of Stephen and just how much bad luck he might be calling down by going further and further into this comparison. It's a really interesting response to fear as well, just to sort of highlight there's a little bit of psychology going on here. We've talked all along about how this book is about O'Brien's perception of ships as the behavioral analysis lab. Almost you might call the textbook definition of being free from mental trauma is if you can recall the emotion of a traumatic event and not be overwhelmed by reliving it. And actually, to be able to distinguish the emotion itself from the recollection of it is, you might say, if you're a psychologist, a sign of good mental health, at least on Stephen's part.
Right.
So Stephen is well adjusted for now. Not sure about all the other members of the crew. We'll see. Anyhow, the ship that they've sighted on the horizon now is a felucca. A felucca with sails flying and no one at the tiller. Sails flying is taken as a signal of distress. No one at the tiller. Something's wrong. A felucca is a small vessel, often propelled by oars and also by one or more lateen sails, or by both. Feluccas are a really, really common design of Mediterranean working boat. There are big 2- and 3-masted feluccas with these lateen sails that you often associate with the Middle East. There are small single-masted feluccas and big enough for a handful of fishermen. Patrick O'Brien, as he looked out across the harbour in Collioure, would have seen, and we can see to this day, if you go to Collioure and harbours like historic harbours in the Mediterranean, you'll see these feluccas, these little fishing boats with a single sloping lateen mast. So, and we'll post out some pictures on the socials when we get around to it of some current day feluccas for us to look at. And Babington, our good friend Babington, is gleefully announcing the ghoulish news that there's a body visible on the deck of this felucca. Stephen spots a further body and says straight away that they have died of the plague. The closer they get, they can see more dead bodies. And Stephen very naturally says, right, I'm going to make up a bag. I'm going to ask to be taken across there, and I'm going to go and treat any survivors. I'm like, this is an important moment that we'll talk about in a second. But right now, everybody's understood what we have to do and what's going to happen next has always been kind of clear, I think. But now Stephen has to learn that what he sees as the natural next course of events is not what the ship and not what Jack sees as the course of events. Jack puts him down very politely, but very firmly. My dear sir, I'm afraid you must not insist or protest. It is mutiny, you know, and you would be obliged to be hanged. Was you to set foot in that felucca, even if you did not bring back the contagion, we should have to fly the yellow flag at Mahon. And you know what that means? And Stephen replies, you mean to sail directly away from that ship, giving it no assistance? Yes, sir, is the reply. Upon your own head, then. Certainly, comes back Jack. And this is another one of these kind of first of many moments, I think, Mike. They're first of many times in the canon where Jack's adherence to military service and naval priorities collides with Stephen's desire to follow causes, sometimes scientific discovery, in this case, humanitarianism. It doesn't seem to be a terribly big deal. O'Brien lets Jack win the argument pretty much flat out. Stephen doesn't really get to put his case, although in reported speech, we kind of reading between the lines, we learn that he must have put it with some vehemence. A few paragraphs later, we learn that he had shaken his fist at Jack. The text says, the log took little notice of this. It could scarcely have found any appropriate official language for saying that the Sophie's surgeon shook his fist at the Sophie's captain, which, by the way, is a hanging offence.
Right.
In any case, it shuffled the whole thing off with the disingenuous spoke Phillicker and 11:15 tact. For it was eager, says O'Brien, to come to the happiest entry it had made for years. So, Mike, we're getting a bit of a drum roll here towards what's coming up in the log here. We've had this clash of Jack's service priority and Stephen's humanitarian priority. We'll have to set aside the fact that this is really the first conflict that's arisen in this otherwise natural and good-natured friendship between Stephen and Jack. Maybe Stephen is just going to have to learn this. This is one more thing for him to learn besides all the naval jargon and all the hierarchies. He's just going to have to learn that that's how it is. Or maybe we're going to have to come back to these two different causes, these two different kind of propelling forces that are driving these two different characters, Jack and Stephen. It's interesting that the crew were really scared. Stephen wasn't scared at all about going across the Heathrow as his natural kind of caregiving priority. The crew had been scared. They had seen this tame African Jeanette, I think that's how you pronounce it, a civet a bit like a cat. And the idea that might jump across and carry the plague across the Sophie had absolutely terrified the crew. No such fear for Stephen. But Mike, let's hold that off for later. Let's talk about this really happy log entry that's coming here.
Yeah, well, and I love this. As you say, we're going to see these conflicts between Stephen and Jack. And part of this, one of those causes that comes up sometimes is Stephen as that rational Enlightenment man, Jack as a little foot in both worlds of the Enlightenment and thinking and the superstition of Navy and the tradition. And he just realized, when he tells Stephen there, look, if you went across and came back, even if you didn't have the plague, half of our crew would die. They would know. It's kind of like, the African shaman or something, the witch doctor putting the curse and boom, your brain kills you. So, and we're going to see this superstition thing throughout the canon and in a fascinating way. But as you say, let's go back to the happiest log entry. And they start with the sight of another sail, the long promised prize now. And we get a little backstory that the crew under Captain Allen had not taken a prize. As a matter of fact, Allen had gotten cruises and they'd never even seen a prize. O'Brien tells us that the oceans had just emptied before them. So almost straight away, they sight another potential target, a Palaka. This ship with kind of one-piece mast, not separate topmasts. And we get a really nice account of how successfully Jack has set up the Sophie and himself for prize chasing. So now he calls upon this nice big square mainsail, and they can start to keep up with this Palaka and keep it in sight. And with the help of Jack's navigation and seamanship, they unfortunately lose her in the twilight and the darkness. But Jack, Jack really comes to the fore here. It's kind of, watching this whole chase here, Ian, that, at one point, O'Brien always tells us kind of can feel the ship, can kind of see the ship, and he realizes that she's being pressed down. And so he gives this order in the midst of them chasing as fast as they can to take in the main royal as they're chasing. And O'Brien had written, rarely had he given an order more reluctantly obeyed. So the crew is like, what's the matter? Are you crazy in their minds? But when the sail comes down, the Sophie picks up speed. Jack's right. Now it's starting to get dark. They can't see the chase. And, O'Brien tells us that Jack takes advantage of the blessed inviolability of a captain. This fact that they cannot disturb the captain when he's on his part of the quarterdeck. Jack really needs this solitude now to think. It's not just pretentious. It's not just, this kind of accoutrement of rank. It's saying he wants to be there in touch with the Sophie, the sea, remembering every detail of the chase. And O'Brien writes that the Palaka had either altered its course or would do so presently. The question was, that is the question for Jack, where would the new course bring her to by dawn? So when they can see her again, are they going to be near her or far away? And Jack's thinking, well, it all depends. Is she French or Spanish? Is she homeward or outward bound? Is the captain cunning or simple? And her sailing qualities. And he's got, he's been watching her closely, so he knows some of these. He's kind of followed her every moment for these last few hours. And O'Brien writes, so in building his reasoning, if such an instinctive process could be called by that name, and essentially using his certainties and the estimates, he comes to his conclusion. She had worn, and she might be laying there right now, kind of with her sails down, trying to escape detection here, while the Sophie passes her in the darkness. Jack's sure of this. She is going to be making sail here for France. Jack's sure she's going to essentially be crossing the Sophie's wake as the Sophie continues to chase after her. And he knows that he's got to tack right now and work to windward. And if he does that, they should be able to see her under their lee at first light. He gives the order to tack in silence. And there's this great line. O'Brien writes, the order and its form had a strangely powerful effect with as much certainty as though it had been a direct revelation. Jack knew that the men were wholly with him, and for a fleeting moment a voice told him that he'd better be right or he would never enjoy this unlimited confidence again.
That's a brilliant moment, isn't it? He's going to come back to this over and over again later on in the canon. That's the sentence that we use all the time in this book, isn't it? We're going to come back to this again and again. But Jack's thought, and in some cases his doubt about whether he's really got the crew's confidence, is a really important part of him feeling okay as a leader. He's done a couple of important things, as well as just kind of waving his sword and pointing, let's go that way. He's had to tell him to do something that's kind of counterintuitive, reducing sail to increase the speed of the ship. And he's had to do something that requires him to show that he's got really special powers of divination and navigation and problem solving and kind of figuring out in advance where the ship is going to be. And he's really growing and gaining strength from the fact that they seem to be happy to follow him now. At least most of them do.
Right.
And it's a great change from a crew that doubts their captain's orders to a crew that are completely with him for now. And we're in this kind of stealthy chasing mode. To get around this, Jack decides that he can't be bothered to ship deadlights in his cabin that would allow him to then show a candle. He's going to go into the guts of the ship. He's going to go to the gun room and hang out there. And it's an awkward and slightly uncomfortable visit for Jack, because he gets a reminder of how isolated he is as the captain. The text says he was an intruder. He had upset their quiet sociability, dried up the purser's literary criticism, and interrupted the chess as effectually as an Olympian thunderbolt. And to top all of that, he gets a reminder that Stephen, his particular friend, is now almost as much of a member as the gunroom's social circle as he is of Jack's. And the text says Jack felt obscurely hurt. And after he had talked for a while, a dry, constrained interchange, it seemed to him, so very polite, he went up on deck again. And even though the crew might be with him in his navigation and his seamanship and his leadership, it's still the captain who is speaking when he's there in the gunroom. And they are speaking back to him only when spoken to. And therefore, it's got this very dry, overly polite tone. And Jack's really conscious of it. He's surprised that Dillon is here playing chess with Stephen, even though it's Dillon's watch below. And Jack's thinking, well, if I was Dillon, I would have been on deck. And Stephen, meanwhile, rather awkwardly steps in to try and help Jack. And he goes on deck, insisting that Jack should wear a woolen garment to counteract the falling damps. And Mike, between these three men, Jack and Stephen and Dillon, how many more times in this chapter, how many more times in this book are they going to misjudge and misunderstand each other's situations and priorities and emotions? Mike, this day is yet young. Before we move on, we've talked a few times about the gun room. I should just point out here, if you, as a new reader of Patrick O'Brian, want to feel confident making your first steps in the online discourse, the online commentary about the Patrick O'Brian books, this is a good one to get straight in your head first. The gun room versus the wardroom. Now, in this era, in the Regency era Royal Navy, officers messed in a place that was called the wardroom if and only if the vessel was a ship of the line, a big, fully rated 2 and 3 deck ship. Aboard a smaller vessel like a frigate or an even smaller vessel like a brig, that place was called the gunroom. So in the modern British and American, and as far as I know, Canadian and Australian navies, the place where officers mess is always called the wardroom these days, regardless of what size the ship is. Hence, this is a really important piece of period detail for Patrick O'Brian. It's not the wardroom, it's the gunroom. Hence, there's a very venerable internet discussion group known as the gunroom of HMS Surprise, hmssurprise.org, and its associated mailing list server. This christening of a place as the gunroom is a really important little token of Patrick O'Brian's period detail here.
Yeah. And boy, I'll tell you, if you want to go back into some fascinating discussions about these books, the archives and the current discussions on the gunroom are amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Good. So we've had all this, we've gone through the night. O'Brian gives us this half hour by half hour little details of everybody being so silent and everything. And the dawn is coming up, and lo and behold, the prize is in sight.
Yeah, it's a real strong reminder for me of the chase that happens in Master and Commander Far Side of the World. But it really reminded me of this remark by the Master. The Master says it had to be more than 100 sea miles, and he brings us up on his tail. That's seamanship, Mr. Pullings. My God, that's seamanship. So Jack's great leadership feat and great navigation and seamanship feat has paid off. And Mike, he's about to turn another trick here. He sets up this young guy, Mowat. Mowat is a teenager. He's young enough that his voice still cracks, but he's old enough to, I think, have already passed all the technical exams for lieutenant. He's officially a master's mate. And Jack basically puts Mowat in command of the rendezvous with this prize. She is just under our lee, says Jack, east by south. You may light up the sloop, Mr. Mowat, and show our force. I don't want her to do anything foolish, such as firing a gun, perhaps hurting some of our people. Let me know when you have laid her aboard. With this he retired, calling for a light and something hot to drink, and from his cabin he heard Mowat's voice, as we heard before, cracking and squeaking with the excitement of his prodigious command. He would happily have died for Jack, as under his orders the Sophie bore up and spread her wings. I'm like, that's a really nice moment of very astute delegation, absolutely winning the heart and the loyalty, quite rightly, of Mowat by giving him this fantastic opportunity to command the ship through this maneuver. And even though all the way through the night we've had this kind of dark, awkward, constrained, slightly bitter tone, as the morning comes, O'Brien's writing is all sweetness and light and caffeine for Jack. It says, Jack leant back now against the curved run of the stern window and let Killick's version of coffee down by gulps into his grateful stomach. And at the same time that its warmth spread through him, so there ran a lively tide of settled, pure, unfevered happiness. A happiness that another commander, remembering his own first prize, might have discerned from the log entry, although it was not specifically mentioned there. And here, Mike, we get, once again, a little snippet from the log. 10:30, tacked. 11, in coursers, reef topsail. AM, cloudy and rain. 4:30, chase observed east by south, distance half a mile. Bore up and took possession of Ditto, which proved to be l'Aimable Louise, French polacca laden with corn and general merchandise for set of about 200 tons, 6 guns and 19 men. Sent her with an officer and 8 men to Mahon. And Mike, just like Patrick O'Brian, to have dug out not only a reference from logs that are authentic, he's got a reference from Admiralty court papers that are authentic as well. There was a real ship called l'Aimable Louise. She was 200 tons. She had a mixed cargo, not quite the same cargo as described here, but she was captured from the French by the British Navy in the American Revolutionary War, about 15 years before the O'Brian timeline here. But great little real-world reference here.
So Jack is delighted. His payoff for all his patience, his preparation, his seeming capers early in the chapters, is complete. He's got a prize. He can get an advance on the prize money from this valuable capture and make an early distribution to the crew so they can have a little drunken run ashore. And, it really unites that crew and unites him with them. And meanwhile, he's thinking he's going to be able to buy some gunpowder and he can exercise the great gun some more. And he's sitting there drinking some of the captured wine, this great wine. Ian, I think you've had some of this before. I've not tasted this.
Yeah, Priorato. I've had it in a wine bar in Madrid. I always thought it was Catalan from the name of it, but anyhow, it's really delicious. I remember sitting in this wine bar drinking Priorato thinking, this is really, really great. I've got to get some when I get home. Really very difficult to get hold of, at least in British wine shops. So if anybody knows of a source, let us know. Maybe it's just, as it perhaps should be, that they keep some of the good stuff for the locals.
Right.
Rather than selling it to the Brits.
Uh-huh. Well, here's Jack nodding off under the influence of this wine and sleepless night chasing this thing. And chatting back and forth to Stephen in just a beautiful scene as he's talking about this. And Ian, you might take us through, where's Jack planning to head here?
Well, they're continuing on this cruise that they've been granted by Lord Keith, who, by the way, is going to be kept sweet by his share of all of this prize money that Jack's starting to send back to Mahon. They tell us that they plan to have a swing north to Cape Creus. I think that's how you say it. Cape Creus is very close to Collioure, which was the O'Brien neighborhood, as we know, and around and along the coast of Catalonia, as long as he can keep up with his water supplies. And he kind of drifts off to sleep thinking, water is going to be the key thing. And we get straight into the next encounter. And the next encounter is with a brig called the Cloma. And by the way, another real reference here, Cloma was the name of a real Danish brig. That was part of the story of Lord Cochrane's first cruise aboard the Sophie's alter ego, the brig Speedy, in the real life escapades of Thomas Cochrane. But we'll come back to more about what Cochrane did with the Cloma later on. This brig, the Cloma, we learn, is almost identical to the Sophie, but she's wearing a Danish flag, so she's an ally. So therefore, she's the object of a social call rather than a broadside and a potential prize. In another bit of scatological wordplay for Patrick O'Brien, the captain's called Ole Bugge, and that's a name that Jack doesn't choose to repeat out loud on his quarterdeck. Ole's pronunciation gets the Patrick O'Brien comedy accent treatment, so alongside Scottish people, Danish people now get their accents lampooned slightly in the text here. And we get some intelligence in return for a case or so of this nice Priorato wine. We get some intelligence from Captain Bugge that there's a French prize just over the horizon to the north. She's headed to Agde, halfway to Marseille. And so that's the cue for the Sophie to head north in pursuit of this potential French prize. Mike, I think that's our cue to head to the bar in pursuit of something nice and red and Spanish. And we'll all be right back after this short break. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/LubbersHole. So welcome back, everybody. We hope you enjoyed a glass of Priorato or whatever you had on your wine rack there. We want to give a special shout out. You heard the message in there about our Patreon supporters. We also want to say that we appreciate the feedback that we get online via social media as well. Big shout out to listener Andy Hall, who's shared on the Facebook Aubrey Maturin Appreciation Society a little update to the world about how we are digging back into the Master and Commander chapters at a slower pace. Thank you, Andy, for that. We hope that you're all enjoying it so far. If you haven't already done so, then you can find us online. We have our own page on Facebook, facebook.com/LubbersHole. You can find us on Twitter. We are at Hole Lubbers. And you can find us in a few other places, as I mentioned online, where the Aubrey Maturin books are getting talked about. So, Mike, there's not much drama this time. There's no great tension as we find and encounter this chase. No particular hurdles for Master's Mate Moet, as the Citoyenne Durand, as she's called, kind of calmly gives up here. It turns out that she gave up without a murmur because she was carrying two precious and delicate cargoes. First, she's carrying barrel upon barrel of gunpowder, And Jack purloins this in the name of efficiency. Only just this side of looting, I would say. I love this, slightly tongue-in-cheek thing. He says, well, there's a lot of damaged stuff aboard that sloop, he says to the gunner. I can see it from here. We shall have to take it away to prevent further spoiling. And in the name of the same appropriation, he grabs the French vessel's launch as well. So the first precious cargo was the gunpowder. The second precious cargo was the master's young, pregnant wife, who's gone into labor just as the ship is taken. And Mike, there's lots of comedy extracted from the horror and the ignorance of this male crew who have no familiarity at all, most of them, with the nature and the sounds and signs of childbirth, as they hear the groans and the shrieks of this woman going through labor. James, says the text, was as stout-hearted as the next man, but the continuous groaning just behind the cabin bulkhead and the awful, hoarse, harsh, animal quality of the cries that broke out through the groaning and their huge volume terrified him. He gazed at the white-faced, distracted, tear-stained husband with a face as appalled as his. And Mike, poor James, representing for a moment all of us unreconstructed males who back in the 18th and 19th century wouldn't have had anything to do with childbirth. Later on, Jack himself says, God love us, what a terrible cry. I am truly sorry to inflict this upon you, Dillon. He's meaning that Dillon's going to take command of the prize. But you see how it is. And finally, O'Brien shares this perspective with the whole of the crew. The Sophies, he says, even the family men looked guilty, concerned, apprehensive. The dreadful, unremitting shrieks went on, and when Stephen appeared at the rail to call out that he must stay aboard, Jack bowed to the obscure justice of this deprivation. And Mike, the only one of them, besides the woman herself, who regards this as regular and routine and all in a day's work, is, of course, Stephen. Now, my friend, he says to the captain, these buckets would be best over the side, and then I recommend you to lie down for a while. Monsieur has a son. So, as nobody has ever said in the Patrick O'Brien books, Mazel tov.
Right. And wish that they would.
And let's dig back into boat names here. Citoyen Durand, the name of this particular ship, was there a real-life Durand that this might have related to?
There really was, which was fascinating because this one was a little hard to dig up here. But in fact, there is a citizen, Margaret Durand, and she was one of France's leading feminists. She started as a stage actress. She became a very good journalist working for France's top newspaper and was actually sent to cover an international feminist congress in supposedly to write a humorous article for this top French newspaper. But she came away a changed woman. She became a leading suffragette who thought, women shouldn't just have the vote, but they should be part of the debate. She actually stood for office. She founded an all-woman newspaper with some of the leading women writers of her time, kind of championed women first in their fields throughout France in all sorts of professions, and found when she needed, printing and was not accommodated, she created the first all-women's printing group. She also was, I believe, quite a beauty, had a pet lion, was known very well in kind of high social circles. So she really raised the profile of feminism in France and Europe to a really unprecedented at that time level of respectability. She has a bibliothèque, a library named after her, right in a specialized Paris library that houses all of her sources. So, of course, Patrick O'Brien, right?
Yeah. And fascinating little bit of juxtaposition here. Assuming that she was the Durand that he was referring to or thinking of when he came up with this name for this boat, and we're getting into the idea of rights and freedom and representation and democracy and feminism. And this is all in our minds if you choose to dig for it, just as we get into this conversation that's coming up between Stephen and James Dillon. And Mike, I love this passage. This is probably the character heart of the book. And Stephen and Dillon have edged around each other so far because they've been in public. They've been in the presence of people in front of whom they can't really be transparent about their past political activities and their allegiances and so on. They're both Irishmen and they both know each other. And Stephen has already hinted about the distaste that they both have for the idea of an informer and a particular kind of informer as well, and a renegade. And I've really, really enjoyed digging back into this conversation here. So with the French crew back on the Sophie as prisoners, with just the sleeping French master and his wife for company, Stephen and James Dillon get to talk alone and in private. Stephen says, "It is only now that we have the opportunity of speaking to one another. I looked forward to this time with great impatience, and now that it has come, I find that in fact there is little to be said." "Perhaps nothing at all," said James. "I believe we understand each other perfectly." And despite that opening exchange, of course, the reality is different, and they talk and talk right through the night. They recalled the last time that they had seen each other, and we get invited to find out about the Irish uprising of 1798 just by the dropping of the names. So let's dig behind the names that get dropped here. Stephen had been meeting with Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who, in the real timeline of history, Irish history, was a leading proponent within the movement of United Irishmen for Irish independence through insurrection, through a French-assisted insurrection against Great Britain. In real life, Edward Fitzgerald was fatally wounded on the eve of the intended uprising during his arrest. And Stephen remembers the early days of the United Irishmen before this insurrection and how they had been really passionately attached to liberty. He said that the word liberty glowed with meaning. They talked also about unity as a cause, but Stephen was skeptical about the group of strange bedfellows that were brought together. He talked about priests, deists, atheists and Presbyterians, visionary Republicans, utopists, and men who merely disliked the Beresfords. And Stephen, at that time, had been full of zeal for humanity at large and sufficiently full of republicanism in those early days, but really not moderate enough for Fitzgerald, the fomenter of this French-assisted insurrection. And people are disliking the Beresfords. Mike, who were the Beresfords, and why might they have been disliked?
Right. Well, on the one hand, from the perspective of Dillon and Stephen's conversation here, they're a very powerful Irish family, kind of multiple MPs in succession, lots of ownership interests and things that opposed to emancipation, the emancipation of Ireland. But even a little bit deeper, the father was a guy who'd become a member of the Privy Council of Great Britain, also kind of a revenue minister in Ireland. So had some people called him sort of the King of Ireland, and he was opposed by some popular politicians. So there were reasons to kind of have some resentment here against this guy, although very helpful in a lot of architecture and great things in Ireland. But the son was also thought to have, it was in his kind of writing studio there that interrogated United Irishmen there. So, definitely in popular politics, they were opposed by some people for some reasons, and certainly in the United Irishmen, a very vehement dislike.
And it's fascinating. We're going to go into quite a deep and sort of nuanced picture of the politics of rebellion against the colonization, the taking over, if you like, of the Irish state by the British Crown, the British government. And we're learning that it's not true necessarily to think that Ireland was just an island full of Catholics kept in poverty by ruthless British overlords, although there were ruthless British overlords and there were plenty of Catholics in poverty. But there was a society that itself was still pretty divided and pretty diverse. And there were these different Protestant sects and there were landowners, and this was potentially a really, really messy situation. And I'm not for a minute going to say that anything good was done about it by the British government, but I'm going to say that it was not a simple matter of one repressed block of people rising up. This was a matter of a coalition being built within what you might call middle-class society in Ireland.
Right.
And at the time, Dillon said that he had been in favor of emancipation because emancipation covered all non-Anglican faiths. So Presbyterians would have been in favor of emancipation just as much as Catholics, for example, religious freedom in general. Anybody who wasn't an Anglican, who wasn't part of following the Church of Ireland / Church of England, was legally excluded from political and economic life and from military service. So Dillon was in favor of reform of that aspect of society, but he wasn't a Republican. He wasn't for overturning the monarchy altogether. He says that a republic in Ireland would become little better than a democracy, in his words, and that a Catholic republic would be ludicrous. Is Dillon saying that I only want middle-class, upright Irish Catholics like me to be in charge, and that, absolute rule is still okay? Is it that he wanted, the Irish gentleman class to stay in power? Or is it just that he's saying he wants to separate the idea of democracy and representation and liberty of that sort from the idea of liberty and freedom to worship? And I think this is a really, really great question. Perhaps then, and certainly these days, we tend to bundle together republicanism and religious freedom and nationalism and self-determination as all one thing. And if you want one of them, you've got to want all of them. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this chapter and about lots of the conversations that we have through the character of Stephen later on in the canon and his politics, is that it presents a more nuanced picture, and that these things, these different kinds of freedom and these different kinds of change in society can be separate from each other. And I'm not sure, I don't think Dillon was guilty of straightforward chauvinism and self-interest on the behalf of middle-class Irish people, but I think he was saying the problem that we had right then in Ireland was religious emancipation. Other things to do with changing society might have to be solved another day through other means.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And what we're seeing is just such a nuanced view and an insight just through these two individuals of how diverse this group of United Irishmen was, and how wildly different things were kind of motivating them, and the different ends they were trying to achieve, all in the same things. We see Stephen kind of growing up in part of this movement, that part that wants, insurrection and kind of overturn. And we've got kind of, in the beginning of this discussion, this test that Stephen took about were you a true United Irishman or not. And we see Dillon in a very different group. His committee kind of not at all about this, let's take the revolution from America and France and bring it to Ireland here with the help of the French. So Stephen, in fact, by the time he had been in this group for a while, had changed himself. And he's telling Dillon about that in fact, the last day that he saw Dillon, who was also coming to see this Fitzgerald, Stephen was there trying to persuade him not to go through with his plans for this rising. But Stephen said he was opposed to violence anyway. But setting that aside, he thought that what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it, and knowing all the informers that were in their organization, that there was just too much risk, and it would kind of result in the ruin of their cause. That, there were certain goals they wanted to meet. Doing it this way was not going to get at that. And the death and ruin of many of the men involved and their families. And Stephen, really passionately describes how he was trying to channel kind of his early essence of belief in this movement to get Fitzgerald to listen to him. And he talks about how much spirit he expended that day, more than any other day, trying to argue as if he still believed enough to get Fitzgerald to listen to him. But Stephen's telling Dillon, in truth, and O'Brien writes, I no longer cared for any cause or any theory of government on earth. I would have not lifted a finger for any nation's independence, fancied or real, and yet I had to reason with as much ardor as though I were filled with the same enthusiasm as in the first days of the Revolution, when we were all overflowing with virtue and love. So again, Stephen's like, I think he kind of like his wanting to go across to the plague ship. It's just, my God, I've got to do something to save all these people. And let me see if I can say something that Fitzgerald will understand. But it's not going to work. And Stephen realizes it's not going to work. He realizes that Fitzgerald is really, kind of paying no attention to him.
Yeah. And Dillon, I don't think is convinced by this. I think Dillon's a more wholehearted, more instinctive rebel. Or at least he was at that time, at that part of his life. And he said, well, maybe you could have been helpful with it, with the sort of the more moderate aspects of this cause. And Stephen said he would not. He'd been chilled by what happened in the French Revolution. He'd been chilled by seeing the consequences of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the brutality, the cruelty, and masses of men on both sides doing unspeakable things to each other. And he says he's now sick of men in masses. And Mike, this quote is one that sticks with me forever. I love this reasoning and real kind of polemic that Stephen brings to his perspective about what he's interested in and why he's interested in it. He says that he would not work to reform Parliament or even bring about the millennium, which, by the way, in Revelations is the 1,000-year reign of Christ, supposed to mean a utopia, a period of good government and prosperity. He wouldn't work at all to bring about transformational change like that. I speak only for myself, mind, said Stephen. It is my own truth alone, but man as part of a movement or a crowd is indifferent to me. He is inhuman. I have nothing to do with nations or nationalism. The only feelings I have for what they are for men as individuals. My loyalties, such as they may be, are to private persons alone. Patriotism will not do, says Dillon. My dear creature, I am done with all debate, but you know as well as I, patriotism is a word, and one that generally comes to mean either my country right or wrong, which is infamous, or my country is always right, which is imbecile. And that's one, for me, Mike, one of the best turned moments of political argument in the whole canon. If there was a fictitious O'Brien, Aubrey, Maturin presidential campaign, this would be paragraph 3, I think, of the stump speech.
Right.
And this phrase, my country right or wrong, has got a bit of history to it. The phrase was used in a speech, a toast actually proposed by Stephen Decatur. Decatur, who we talked about a few books ago in connection with the War of 1812, Decatur, an American officer, proposed it as a toast in 1812. Actually, it might have been after 1812, to do with the War of 1812. So actually, after the strictly defined timeline that we're in now, but never mind. Stephen Decatur proposes this toast, meaning America, my country, right or wrong, that was picked up in turn by a senator called Carl Schurz in 1871, who espoused the same thing, basically expressing my country right or wrong, meaning an unvarnished, jingoistic, I support my country no matter whether it's right or wrong. This may, in fact, have been inspired by a phrase that Edmund Burke had used back in 1790 about how you've got to love your country, and if you don't love your country, then you've got to make it lovely or lovable. And then the jingoistic aspect of this was kind of turned over and criticized in typically kind of skeptical style by the British author G.K. Chesterton in 1901. And Chesterton anticipates what O'Brien might have been thinking of writing 70 years later. Chesterton says, my country, right or wrong, is a thing that no patriot would think of saying, except in a desperate case. It is like saying, my mother, drunk or sober. Doesn't say very much for Chesterton's view of his mother, but I really love the idea of picking apart this phrase and doubting and challenging unvarnished jingoism, which is absolutely, I think, where Stephen is. So, Mike, as we've gone quite deeply into our conversations about Ireland and Stephen and Dillon. We've got the chance next week, I think, to hear some more about the history of that time and those events. We've learned so much about the United Irishmen, and I would love to know more. And you've lined us up a great authority on that subject. Absolutely. We're going to be sitting down next week to talk about 1798 with historian and entertainer and all-round funny guy, Paddy Cullivan. Looking forward to that. Yeah, for sure. And talking about the political and talking about how Maturin's allegiance is to persons rather than institutions, I think gets us to the point of turning the conversation now in the direction of other connections to other people around, and in particular to Dillon's connection or otherwise with Jack Aubrey. Yeah, because Dillon actually says, well, he notes that after Stephen just said that his affection is for people, his kind of loyalty is to people alone. Dillon says that, he notes that Stephen is very fond of Captain Aubrey. And Stephen says, he's sorry that Dillon is not, and asks why. And, he says, he's kind of like in between Dillon and Aubrey, and he has great esteem for both of them. And Dillon is a little bit flippant at first. He says, well, perhaps it's because Aubrey has a command and I don't. And then, Stephen uses this Latin tag, Ian. Non amo te sadidi.
Yeah, non amate sediti. So this is actually an epigram from what we call Martial, the Roman poet, but it becomes a bit, some say, apocryphal story later out of the annals of Oxford, and becomes almost, it's used as almost a children's nursery rhyme here. That it's kind of this in the nursery rhyme form. It's, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. The reason why I cannot tell, but this I know and know full well. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. So supposedly this guy's going to get kicked out of Oxford for bad behavior. And he says, well, if you can translate Marshall's epigram, I'll let you stay. And he translates it to say how he feels about the guy who's imposing this punishment here. But not Sabiti, the original target of this line about, but really it's getting at Stephen saying, are you just saying it and you don't really know why? And Dillon says, no. It's Aubrey's eagerness for prizes, for profit, like a starving privateer rather than for honor. He couldn't believe that, the captain wouldn't leave the deck all night while chasing this polacca versus chasing a man of war. And it's fascinating because we remember Jack saying he couldn't believe Dillon left the deck, even though he wasn't on watch during the same chase. These guys see the world differently. And then, and then Dillon says, and then right after he catches his prize, boom, he's off exercising the great guns again. And, Stephen is kind of saying, well, couldn't the great guns be used for honorable purposes? But he keeps prodding Dillon to speak his mind. And then Dillon finally kind of steps on it. He says, well, Aubrey keeps encouraging this pederast Marshall, and that's indecent, he says. And it alludes that he can use much worse words for it. And Stephen tells Dillon that, look, Aubrey's completely unaware of Marshall's affections, if you will. And Stephen's trying to tell him a little bit about Aubrey, that he's not as kind of aware of people on some level like others are, and that Aubrey thinks pederasts only trouble, and his quote is, powder monkeys and choir boys. So that, and this gets back to our discussion, a chapter or so ago about this idea of homosexuality versus, pedophiles here, and how it's kind of gotten, mixed up here. But Dillon and Stephen then continued this discussion as Stephen's telling Dillon about how he tried to educate Jack a little. Ian, you might want to take this here.
Well, we kind of get this serious conversation descends a little bit into butt humor here. I made a circuitous attempt at enlightening him a little, but he looked very knowing. He's talking about Jack here. He looked very knowing and said, don't tell me about rears and vices. I've been in the Navy all my life. And James Dillon replies, then surely he must be wanting a little in penetration. And Stephen says, James, I trust there was no mens rea in that remark. And mens rea, it's almost too crude to point out. Mens rea, the Latin tag, is a reference to criminal intent, a guilty mind. But O'Brien, even in the depths of this very serious conversation, can't resist what looks like a pretty scatological pun. Yeah. So why is sodomy always the butt of these jokes? Yeah.
Right. I kept reading, we had the goat and tea or not tea after the sodomy incident. The last one we had ole bugger earlier. Now we've got this mens rea. And I kept saying, another sodomy joke. What a pain in the ass.
Boom.
Right. But I guess they do get you in the end.
Oh, Mike, this is high quality material. I never knew you'd done a tour doing stand up in fraternity houses. That's amazing.
This is what you get for listening to this chapter 5 times through Patrick Tull walking around the farm. It's like, wait, no, I can't take the sodomy joke one more time. But luckily, we're now perhaps past them. We've put them to an end.
Maybe then, by the way, Stephen and James are a long way down a bottle of really good quality brandy by this point. Dillon goes back up on deck to check on the crew, and maybe the conversation is winding down. And he comes back in a sort of conciliatory tone. He says, I am too touchy, I know, but sometimes when you're surrounded with proddies, which is, crude slang for Protestants, when you're surrounded with them and you hear their silly, underbred cant, you fly out. And since you cannot fly out in one direction, you fly out in another. It is a continual tension, as you ought to know, if anyone. Dillon asks if Stephen knew he was a Catholic. Stephen said that he'd known that some of Dillon's family were Catholics, but that he had imagined that it would put Dillon in a difficult position with the oath that he would have to swear in order to have a lieutenant's commission. And we heard earlier on that the oath that you have to swear involves utterly renouncing the Pope, among other things. Not in the least, said James. My mind is perfectly at ease as far as that is concerned. And then we get a little bit of the inward dialogue of Stephen. That is what you think, my poor friend, said Stephen to himself, pouring out another glass to hide his expression. And Dillon seemed to be about to discuss this some more, and they turn back to trivial reminiscing about old days, and they finish up the bottle, and Dillon goes back up on deck again. And when he returns this time, he says he's also upset, maybe not having been promoted for his action in the Dart. And he asks Stephen, who was it who was said to have earned more by his prick than his practice? And Mike, the question's not answered directly in the text, but it's answered when we dig a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's Selden that's being talked about, but what he doesn't say is that it is a line about John Selden, but the line about John Selden, who supposedly slept with the Countess of Kent with the full knowledge of her husband, and after her husband, the Earl's death, Selden married the Countess. This was said by an English antiquarian, a guy named John Aubrey, who wrote this little book full of little biographies called Brief Lives. So it's very much Dillon bringing up this line, which was written by a John Aubrey, and he's taking a poke at our John Jack Aubrey. I think suggesting here that perhaps Aubrey was promoted because of his affair with Molly Hart, and maybe he's suggesting that Captain Hart is okay with that, and therefore push Aubrey up for promotion, but not Dillon.
Yeah, and I don't think Dillon is in a mood to have any of his points or his whataboutisms kind of pushed back by Stephen. He's pretty sure that he's allowed to object to Aubrey on a bunch of different grounds, some of which are arguable, but some of which don't have to be arguable. Yeah.
Stephen does come back and tell Dillon that, in Jack Aubrey's case, that consideration is irrelevant. And I think we think that Stephen probably knows that Jack and Hart are at each other's throats. Hart is not working in Jack's interest here, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. But Dillon does add that, he really, really wants to get promoted, and that serving under a prize hunting captain is not the most direct route to promotion.
So hang on, we've had the fling that maybe it's because I'm a Catholic, maybe it's because I lack interest, maybe it's because I didn't get recognition for the action in the Dart, maybe it's because Jack is all about the money and I'm all about the honor. And Stephen is going to not let this one go either. He says, well, it's easy for a rich man to despise money. And Dillon protests that he has all this land that's actually worthless, it's bog and mountain. And Stephen comes up with this great rejoinder. I have never yet known a man admit that he was either rich or asleep. Perhaps the poor man and the wakeful man have some great moral advantage. So he's not having any of this. And he goes on to say, well, Jack is brave. He could lead them to glorious and remarkable actions. And Dillon is doubting this, and he's willing to cite the galley in evidence. Jack had turned back from pursuing the galley to go back and look after the rest of the convoy, and Dillon had taken that really badly. Stephen says that this was Jack being prudent and doing his duty, and Dillon just goes back to the idea that Dillon wants to be promoted and says, I want no republic. I stand by settled, established institutions and by authority, so long as it is not tyranny. All I ask is an independent parliament that represents the responsible men of the kingdom and not merely a squalid parcel of placemen and place seekers. Given that, I am perfectly happy with the English connection, perfectly happy with the two kingdoms. I can drink the loyal toast without choking, I do assure you. So he's really not willing to let Jack be seen as having any kind of prior claim or higher claim to duty. Dillon is all about duty and honor, and he's really still willing to see Jack as a little bit tainted by this idea of being a prize seeker.
Well, it's dawn. Dillon puts out the light and invites Stephen up on deck to see some interesting birds off the coast of Minorca there. And then Dillon adds, you remember when this whole conversation started, Stephen said, well, now that we've got this moment, there's not much to say. But Dillon ends it saying, I cannot tell what possessed me to speak so rancorously. And he's looking unhappy and bewildered. He says, I do not think I have ever done so before. Have not expressed myself well, clumsy, inaccurate, not what I meant, nor what I meant to say. We understood one another better before ever I opened my mouth. And these are the closing words of chapter 5.
Wow. And again, we've said this before. It's a really, really great moment. It's fantastically written, really great characterization, takes us deep into the heart of these two men. I hear what James Dillon says. We understood each other better before we started the conversation. For me as a reader, I think I understand James Dillon. I understand Stephen Maturin, not completely yet, but a heck of a lot better for having been with them as they've had this conversation. And there are plenty of moments in life where maybe we've got the opportunity to really open up to somebody else and perhaps don't listen to the words that we ourselves are saying. And other people get to learn more about us, and we miss the opportunity for a bit of self-learning, a bit of self-knowledge and some perspective. Not that Stephen Maturin's career is going to be glitteringly laden with perfect self-perception and perfect perspective. No, not by a long way. But Mike, here's the thing. So I'm really fascinated by this chapter, really fascinated by learning more about James Dillon and Stephen Maturin. Whenever I think about the characters of the Aubrey Maturin novels, I think I would be very happy to bump into Jack Aubrey and or Stephen Maturin. At the bar, at the train station, at a dinner party, in a weird, fantastic world where I get to meet the heroes of books that I've read. I would love to spend time in company with Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, either or alone. James Dillon has got lots in common with Stephen, lots in common with Jack Aubrey, and he wants some great things. He wants honor, and he wants emancipation and freedom for members of Irish society, and he wants to do many, many right things, but I don't like him.
Right.
And O'Brien has done a very skillful job of making him really not very likable and not very empathetic. He's not unkind. He's not ignorant. He's got some really fair criticisms of Jack Aubrey and his conduct. It's totally forgivable that James Dillon is conflicted. We're all a bit conflicted, but I still don't like him. What do you think? Help me restore the likability of James Dillon.
Well, it's funny because I really wanted to like James Dillon, and I did like him for a while. There were little niggling things, but I think when we got here, I think so many times there are stories that we tell ourselves. Yeah. And the stories that we tell ourselves drive our emotions, and those emotions drive our actions, and we need to change those stories. And I think this was one of those great moments where, they're both drinking. If they could remember what they said, they've had a lot to drink and they've been up all night. And I remember these dorm room discussions that went all night. Even when we tried to write it down and still couldn't read our handwriting, but we had solved all the problems of the world. But, if Dillon could have gotten just a little bit of insight here, God, he's terribly conflicted. And I think it's really hard to be around people who are so driven in their view of the world by these stories that they tell themselves and unwilling to examine those stories. And I think Stephen was once again, it's almost the mirror image. I've talked to Fitzgerald and I was trying to get him to see things. Now I'm talking to Dillon and I'm trying to get him to see things. And, I think here Stephen was not trying to act like he believed what Dillon believed. Clearly, they thought very differently about the Irish uprising and what their aims were. But, I'd love to have a beer with Stephen and Jack. I'd love to have a beer with Stephen and Jack and Dillon. I think that's the world that Stephen wants to live in. But right now, I'm having a hard time thinking about doing that with Dillon.
Yeah. And it raises all sorts of questions about where this is going to lead, because the relationship between these three men is clearly, it's important because we've begun to care about them as characters. It's important because they're closeted in together on this warship that's got to do some warlike things and put itself into danger. And how are they going to help that? We already know that their motivations cross over. Even Jack and Stephen have got some different motivations and some different things that they want from life. it raises some really, really fascinating questions. Besides the fact that it's great writing, besides the fact that O'Brien has done a great job of painting these character pictures for us with really just dialogue, with just this conversation, without, lots and lots of very, very expository kind of backstory stuff. We've had action, we've had conversations about history and social change and liberty and philosophy and politics, and we've had emotional insights, and we've had self-deception and reflection. Where do we go next? We're headed back to Minorca. We're headed back to Mahon. James Dillon is headed straight back to Mahon with this prize, and presumably the Sophie is going to be on her way back to Mahon at some point. There's still time and miles left on the cruise that they're having at the behest of Lord Keith. Jack has got plans for more places he'd like to sail to and more places he'd like to hole up and ambush some prizes. We've got this brewing tension between Jack and Dillon, perhaps between Dillon and Stephen himself. Is Dillon going to keep making Jack the bad guy for the disappointments in his life, or is there something that Jack's goodwill and leadership and seamanship and good fortune, something that Jack can use to pull this relationship out of the bag? It's fascinating.
Yeah, and can Stephen broker some peace between these guys and help them to see themselves and see each other a little more clearly?
He's on that. Yeah, he's aboard the ship as an outsider, as the kind of Greek chorus. Maybe he can do that for them.
Right. Well, I don't know. I think there's only one thing for it. What do you say, Ian, to a little bit more Patrick O'Brien next week?
With all my heart.
No, I can't take the sodomy joke one more time. But luckily, we're now perhaps past them. We've put them to an end.